He found her in the flicker of a dying neon sign, clutching his $2,000 leather wallet to her chest like it was the only thing keeping her heart beating. Kang Dae-hyun, the Iron Shadow, leaned in, his sharp features casting a jagged silhouette against the brick, while his enforcer's hand moved toward the cold steel at his belt. She was a child, and she was trapped between a mafia's pride and the edge of a blade. The humid Seoul heat had been pressing down on the back alleys of the district for 6 hours straight. The kind of heavy, oily air that made the smell of expensive cigarettes and alley trash stick to everything it touched. Amara watched the ink on Dae-hyun's neck, the intricate hand-shaped icon and geometric symbols, shimmer in the damp light as her own breath came in shallow, panicked hitches. The digital clock on a nearby storefront blinked 12:02 a.m. She'd been hiding in the shadows since the sun went down, her worn plaid flannel shirt damp with sweat and fear. At 9 years old, Amara had learned that the world was a predator. She'd started in a state-run home before being shuffled into a foster system that saw her as a paycheck rather than a person. She tried to be good, then tried to be invisible when the hunger became a constant, gnawing companion. In the end, the sheer desperation of an empty stomach made her walk into the dragon's den. The switchblade snapped open with a metallic hiss that cut through the heavy, humid air of the alleyway. Kim Suk-woo stepped forward, his eyes as cold as the steel in his hand. The Shadow's reputation is built on one thing, boss. Consequences, he growled, the blade catching the red flicker of a distant neon sign. If we let a street rat walk away with your wallet, every gutter dweller in Seoul will think we've gone soft. Rules are rules. Kang Dae-hyun didn't move. He remained leaning against the damp crate, a cigarette smoldering between his tattooed fingers. His sharp gaze remained fixed on the small girl trembling before him. She looked so tiny in the oversized plaid flannel shirt, her knuckles white as she crushed the expensive leather wallet against her chest. To Suk-woo, she was a liability to be dealt with. To Dae-hyun, she was a puzzle. He noticed the way her high natural bun was slightly lopsided, the way her breath came in ragged, desperate hitches, and the way her eyes, wide and glassy, never once looked at the knife. They were locked on his face, searching for a mercy that shouldn't exist in a place like this. Dae-hyun exhaled a long plume of smoke, silencing Suk-woo with a single, sharp tilt of his head. He pushed off the crate and knelt, his joints popping in the silence. The Iron Shadow was now at eye level with the thief. He looked at the tattoos on his own hands, symbols of a life spent taking, and then at the girl's small, shaking fingers. "You've got courage, little bird," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "Or you're very stupid. Do you know who I am? Do you know what happens to people who take from me?" Amara didn't flinch at the threat. Her lower lip trembled, and a single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. She didn't beg for her life. She didn't offer an excuse. Instead, she leaned in slightly, her voice a ghost of a whisper that hit Dae-hyun harder than any bullet ever could. "I'm hungry," she breathed. 3 words. In that moment, the rain-slicked alleyway seemed to vanish. Dae-hyun wasn't a feared mafia boss anymore. He was a boy again, shivering in a Busan gutter, staring at a bakery window with a stomach that felt like it was eating itself from the inside out. He saw the same hollow ache in her eyes that he had carried for decades. The ice he had carefully built around his heart didn't just melt. It shattered. He stood up abruptly, his leather jacket creaking. "Put the knife away, Suk-woo," he commanded, his tone final. "Boss, you can't be serious." The enforcer spat, his face contorting in disbelief. "What are you doing?" Dae-hyun reached out and gently took the wallet from Amara's unresisting hands, tucking it back into his pocket. He then held out a hand to her, his tattooed palm open and non-threatening. "I'm going to do something I should have done a long time ago," Dae-hyun said, his eyes flashing with a new, dangerous kind of purpose. "Get the car. We aren't going to the station. We're going to eat." The black sedan glided through the neon-lit streets of Seoul, a silent predator moving through a sea of glass. Inside the plush interior, the air was thick with the scent of expensive leather and the unspoken fury of Kim Suk-woo. The enforcer sat in the front, his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror, waiting for the order to turn toward the shipping docks or a windowless basement where the Iron Shadow usually settled debts. Amara sat huddled against the door, her small hands clutching the hem of her damp plaid flannel shirt. She looked at the man beside her, the Asian man with the sharp, defined profile and slicked-back dark hair, and braced for the worst. Instead, the car pulled up to the shimmering marble entrance of the Grand Imperial. "Boss, you can't be serious," Sukwu hissed as the valet opened the door. "This is a 5-star establishment. Bringing a street rat in there? It's an insult to the family." Dae-hyun didn't even glance at him. He stepped out, his black leather jacket creaking as he reached back to offer a tattooed hand to the girl. Amara hesitated, her high natural bun messy and her face streaked with grime, before placing her trembling hand in his. The restaurant was a world of crystal chandeliers and hushed whispers that died the moment Dae-hyun walked in. The maitre d' started to move forward, his gaze landing on the girl's worn flannel and the tattoos crawling up Dae-hyun's neck. But he froze when he met the boss's intense, commanding gaze. Without a word, the staff cleared a path to a secluded corner table. Dae-hyun pulled out a velvet chair for the girl who had just tried to rob him. As she sat, looking tiny and vulnerable against the gold-leafed walls, Dae-hyun leaned in. "Bring her everything," he commanded the waiter, his voice a low rasp. "Bread, steak, fruit, whatever she wants. And keep it coming until she says stop." When the first plate of warm, buttered rolls arrived, the aroma seemed to break something inside Amara. Her eyes, wide and fearful, locked onto the bread as if it were a hallucination. Dae-hyun watched her, his own past as a starving boy in the gutters of Busan reflecting in her desperate gaze. As she took the first bite, her small shoulders finally dropped, and the Iron Shadow felt a dormant moral compass begin to stir for the first time in a decade. The crystal water glass looked like a giant diamond in Amara's small, dirt-streaked hand. She drank with a desperate intensity, her eyes never leaving Dae-hyun, as if he might vanish if she blinked. Around them, the high society diners of Seoul continued their hushed conversations, carefully ignoring the tattooed man in the leather jacket and the child in the stained flannel. Across the table, Dae-hyun watched her, his sharp features softened by the dim, golden light. He didn't eat. He simply waited. "Slow down, little bird," he said, his voice a low, rhythmic rasp. "Nobody is going to take it from you." She set the glass down with a shaky click. For the first time, the terror in her eyes was replaced by a flickering curiosity. She looked at the geometric tattoos on his hands, then up at the ink trailing into his hairline. "What is your name?" he asked. She swallowed hard, her small shoulders tensing. "They call me Amara," she whispered. Then her voice gained a sliver of strength. "But my mother, she called me Grace." Dae-hyun felt a sharp tug in his chest. Grace. It was a name that belonged in a church or a garden, not a damp alleyway behind a gambling den. He leaned in, his multiple ear piercings catching the light. "Where is your mother, Grace?" The girl's gaze dropped to the table. The story spilled out in broken, jagged pieces. There had been a state-run home, then a foster family who saw children as nothing more than state-issued paychecks. When the funding was stretched thin, they didn't offer a hand. They offered the door. She had been cast out days ago, told that the system had no more room for a mouth it couldn't afford to feed. "They said I was a burden," Grace murmured, her fingers twisting a loose thread on her plaid sleeve. "They said the streets were better at taking care of trash like me." Behind Dae-hyun, Sukwu shifted, his face a mask of cold indifference. But Dae-hyun's eyes burned with a focused fire. He knew that system. He knew the men who profited from the silence of hungry children. The Iron Shadow hadn't just caught a thief. He had found a mirror of his own forgotten soul. "The people who left you in that alley," Dae-hyun said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy velvet. "They think they are untouchable." He reached across the table, his tattooed hand grounding her. "They're wrong." The neon lights of the city felt like cold fire as the black sedan glided toward the rusted edge of the district. Inside the car, the silence was heavy, broken only by the faint clicking of Dae-hyun's silver earrings as he turned his head. He looked at the list of names in his hand. Men who had turned Grace's hunger into a business model. To the world, he was the Iron Shadow, a man of violence and hidden morality. Tonight, he would be a ghost of retribution. The first stop was a dimly lit office above a pawn shop. Mr. Park, a man who pocketed state stipends while starving the children in his care, didn't even have time to scream. The door didn't burst open. It simply ceased to be a barrier as Dae-hyun stepped into the room. The boss didn't draw a weapon. He didn't need to. He simply leaned over the desk, his tattooed hands, etched with the geometry of 1,000 sins, resting on the man's paperwork. The Iron Shadow leaned in, his sharp features illuminated by the flickering desk lamp. He didn't ask questions. He delivered a verdict. By the time Dae-hyun walked out, Park was a shell of a man, his bank accounts flagged and his reputation incinerated by a single, icy stare. Suk-woo watched from the shadows of the hallway, his face a mask of cold disapproval. "This isn't business, boss," the enforcer muttered as they headed back to the car. "This is a crusade. The families in the north won't like us rattling the cages of the city officials." Dae-hyun stopped, his leather jacket creaking in the damp air. He looked at Suk-woo with an intensity that made the younger man take a half-step back. "The families in the north don't matter," Dae-hyun said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, velvet rasp. "What matters is that by sunrise, the men who failed that girl will wish they had never been born." The next stop was a district director's penthouse. No doors were kicked and no shots were fired. Yet as the Iron Shadow moved through the night, a trail of broken careers and terrifying realizations followed in his wake. He was dismantling their world piece by piece, leaving only the cold, lingering fear that the Shadow was watching. For Grace, it was a future she couldn't yet imagine. For the predators of Seoul, it was the end of the line. The air in the private backroom of Club Yangon was thick with the scent of bitter tea and the heavy silence of men who lived by the blade. Kim Suk-woo sat at the head of the low table, his face a mask of cold, calculating fury. In front of him sat 3 subcommanders, their eyes reflecting the dim amber glow of the overhead lantern. For years, they had followed the Iron Shadow without question. But tonight, the atmosphere was different. The legend of Kang Dae-hyun was being dismantled not by an enemy, but by the perceived weakness he showed for a child in a plaid flannel shirt. "He's compromised," Suk-woo said, his voice a low, dangerous rasp that cut through the silence. He didn't look at the men. He looked at his own hands, steady and devoid of the softness he now saw in his boss. A leader who hunts slumlords for a street rat is no longer a leader. He's a liability. The northern families are already laughing. They smell blood in the water, and it's not because of our strength. It's because of his weakness. One of the subcommanders shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flickering toward the door. "But he's the Shadow. He built this empire with those tattooed hands. No one has been more ruthless. He built it on iron," Suk-woo snapped, his eyes flashing with the cold light of street justice. "Now he's trading that iron for grace. If we don't excise this rot, the whole organization collapses. The rules of the street aren't suggestions. You steal, you pay. You lead, you remain cold." Dae-hyun has forgotten the first rule of survival. Mercy is a luxury we can't afford. The conspiracy took shape in the shadows. Suk-woo wasn't just planning a replacement. He was planning a clinical correction. He knew Dae-hyun would be distracted. His focus split between the Syndicate and the safety of the girl. It was the perfect opening. As the men nodded in grim agreement, Suk-woo felt a dark satisfaction. He would remove the Iron Shadow to save the gang's reputation, even if it meant spilling the blood of the man who had once been his mentor. "The girl is the key," Suk-woo whispered, the words hanging in the air like a death sentence. "He's turned her into his heart. And everyone knows what happens when you strike the heart." The betrayal was no longer a thought. It was a countdown. In the neon-stained darkness, the enforcer prepared to turn the hunter into the hunted. The rain had returned, a cold, relentless drizzle that turned the shipping containers into towering monoliths of rusted iron. Kang Dae-hyun stood at the edge of the pier, his black leather jacket slick with moisture and his eyes narrowed against the gray mist. In his hand, he crushed a small piece of fabric he had found caught on a jagged fence. A scrap of white, red, and blue plaid. It was a piece of the flannel shirt he had seen Amara wearing just hours before, a symbol of the innocence he had vowed to protect. The Iron Shadow felt a coldness in his veins that had nothing to do with the weather. It was the realization that his mercy had become the very weapon used against him. He did not wait for backup. He knew Kim Suk-woo would be watching from the darkness, waiting for this perceived softness to lead the boss into the kill zone. Dae-hyun walked into the center of the cavernous warehouse, his boots echoing against the concrete floor like the ticking of a countdown. The air smelled of salt, diesel, and betrayal. High above, suspended by a heavy industrial chain, a small figure hung in the shadows. It was Amara, her high natural bun disheveled and her face pale with terror. She was gagged, but her eyes, wide and glassy, screamed a silent warning as she saw him enter the light. "You should have stayed in the car, boss." Suk-woo's voice drifted from the high catwalks, dripping with cold, street-level disdain. "You've traded a kingdom for a stray. Now the rules say you lose both." Dae-hyun looked up, his sharp features illuminated by the flickering, overhead sodium lights. The intricate tattoos on his neck and hands seemed to pulse in the gloom, marking him as a man born of violence. He did not reach for a weapon. He simply stood there, a solitary figure in leather and ink, facing the dozen red laser dots that suddenly bloomed across his chest. "She isn't a stray," Dae-hyun replied, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that carried to every shadowed corner. "She's the only thing in this city that isn't for sale." He stepped forward, crossing the invisible line Suk-woo had drawn. He knew the cost of every inch he gained. But as he looked at the trembling little bird in the red flannel, he realized he wasn't walking into a trap. He was walking toward the only shred of humanity he had left. The Iron Shadow was ready to burn the world down to keep her safe. The red laser dots danced across Dae-hyun's black leather jacket, resting like burning embers over his heart. He didn't flinch. Instead, he looked up into the rafters where Suk-woo waited, his sharp, tattooed profile illuminated by the flickering, overhead sodium lights. "You talk about the rules of the street, Suk-woo." Dae-hyun's voice was a low, gravelly rasp that echoed through the salt-thick air of the warehouse. "But you forgot the most important one. The shadow doesn't walk into a trap. He is the trap." As the words left his lips, the darkness behind the rusted shipping containers came alive. The Iron Shadow had spent years building a syndicate on a foundation of loyalty, and the men who still believed in his dormant moral compass emerged from the gloom. The sudden metallic click of a dozen safety catches being disengaged filled the room. The laser dots on Dae-hyun's chest vanished as Suk-woo's gunmen realized they were now the ones caught in a crossfire. The rebellion didn't end in a bloodbath, but in a crushing, clinical silence. Dae-hyun moved with a lethal grace, his tattooed hands disarming Suk-woo before the enforcer could even process the shift in power. He didn't kill the traitor. He simply looked at him with a stern yet curious expression that promised a much slower, more thorough kind of ruin. With a single gesture, Dae-hyun signaled his men to lower the industrial chain. He caught Amara as she fell, her trembling weight small and fragile against his rugged leather jacket. He pulled the gag from her mouth and felt her bury her face into his chest, her messy natural bun pressing against the ink on his neck. "It's over, little bird," he whispered, his eyes flashing with a cold, final purpose. The iron verdict was absolute. By the time the sun began to peek through the rainy mist of the pier, the evidence Dae-hyun had orchestrated was already in the hands of the authorities. The corrupt officials and the predatory slumlord who had abandoned Grace were being rounded up in a simultaneous strike. Their bank accounts were emptied, their influence erased, and their futures traded for life sentences behind bars. Suk-woo was left to the mercy of the streets, bankrupt, exiled, and hunted. The Iron Shadow had dismantled a rebellion and a corrupt system in a single night, ensuring that the predators would never see daylight again. As he carried a sleeping Grace toward the car, he knew the man who had walked into the warehouse was gone, replaced by a guardian who finally understood the meaning of his power. The smoke from Dae-hyun's cigarette curled into the sterile, cool air of the glass-walled office, a stark contrast to the rain-drenched grit of the docks. He sat behind a mahogany desk, his black leather jacket draped over the back of the chair, revealing the full extent of the ink crawling up his arms. Across from him, a lawyer in a suit that cost more than a mid-sized car looked at the documents with a mixture of professional detachment and suppressed fear. The Iron Shadow didn't belong in a room this clean, yet he was the one dictating the terms. "The fund is to be absolute," Dae-hyun said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that left no room for negotiation. "Tuition, housing, medical, and a stipend that increases every year. She is never to know where it comes from. To her, it's an anonymous scholarship, a gift from a ghost." The lawyer nodded, his pen scratching against the heavy bond paper. "And the oversight, Mr. Kang? My men will watch the perimeter of her life," Dae-hyun replied, his sharp features illuminated by the early morning light hitting the skyscrapers of Seoul. "Not from the inside. She needs to breathe air that doesn't smell like gunpowder. But if anyone so much as looks at her with the wrong intent, I want to know before they even draw breath." Downstairs, in the back of the idling sedan, Amara, now solely Grace in Dae-hyun's mind, sat with a social worker he had personally vetted through a series of interviews that would have terrified a saint. She was wearing a new coat, soft and warm, but she still clutched the old, torn plaid flannel in her lap like a security blanket. She looked up at the tinted windows of the high-rise, her high natural bun silhouetted against the glass. She didn't know the man with the tattooed hands was currently signing away a small fortune to ensure she never had to steal a wallet again. Dae-hyun stood up, his multiple ear piercings catching the light as he looked down at the street. He saw the car pull away, carrying the little bird toward a life of safety, structure, and enough food to last a lifetime. He felt a strange, hollow ache in his chest, a phantom limb of a heart he thought he'd lost in the gutters of Busan. He was a creature of the dark, a man of iron and shadow, and he knew he couldn't walk in the light with her. But as the car vanished into the city traffic, he realized that being a guardian didn't mean holding her hand. It meant making sure no one ever forced her to let go of her own. The Iron Shadow would remain in the dark, a silent, lethal sentinel over the life of a girl named Grace. The sun over the University Plaza was a brilliant, unforgiving white, a stark contrast to the midnight oil and rain of the alleyways where her life had almost ended. Grace stood among a sea of black robes, her graduation cap sitting atop her neatly styled hair. She looked radiant, her face no longer streaked with grime or hollowed by hunger, but glowing with the quiet confidence of a woman who had conquered every obstacle in her path. As she clutched her medical degree to her chest, she didn't realize she was holding it in the exact same spot where she had once clutched a stolen leather wallet. She lived her life believing she was a miracle of luck and a mysterious, anonymous scholarship. She never knew about the Iron Shadow that had moved ahead of her for years, like a snowplow clearing a path through a blizzard. She didn't know about the predatory men who had tried to block her internships, only to vanish overnight after a quiet visit from a man in a black leather jacket. She never suspected that the prestigious hospital she was about to join as a pediatrician had received a significant, untraceable donation just weeks before her final interview. In the far corner of the plaza, shaded by a sprawling oak tree, a man leaned against the trunk. Kang Dae-hyun hadn't changed much, though the lines around his eyes were deeper now. His dark hair was still meticulously slicked back, and the sharp, geometric tattoos on his neck and temple caught the sunlight, marking him as a relic of a world Grace would never have to see again. He watched her through dark sunglasses, his sharp profile as intense and commanding as ever. His hands, still covered in the ink of 1,000 sins, were steady as he adjusted the silver studs in his ears. He didn't move toward her. He didn't need a thank you or a moment in the light. Seeing her stand there, a healer in a world of hurt, was the only verdict he required to satisfy his dormant moral compass. He had traded his iron for her grace, and in her success, The Iron Shadow had finally found his own silent redemption. As the crowd erupted into cheers and Grace threw her cap into the air, Dae-hyun pushed off the tree, turned his back to the light, and vanished into the shadows, a silent, eternal sentinel over the girl who had saved him by asking for bread.